In the spring of 1873, in the quiet farmlands of Pennsylvania's Carbon County, the Kellner family became the center of a phenomenon that defied nature, reason, and science. On a rain-soaked April morning, Elizabeth Kellner gave birth not to one, not to two, but to 4 identical sons. There was no warning, no modern scanning equipment, and certainly no precedent. The midwife, a seasoned woman who had delivered over 100 babies, reportedly dropped her towel in stunned silence when the 3rd baby emerged, followed, moments later, by a 4th. She would later claim she almost fainted. The odds of naturally occurring identical quadruplets are estimated today at 1 in several million, even with advanced fertility methods. In 1873, such an event was nearly unthinkable. The Kellner family, composed of Elizabeth, her husband Wilhelm, a German immigrant coal miner, and their 2 older daughters, had been living a modest but content life in the foothills of the Appalachians. The arrival of 4 nearly indistinguishable boys, all screaming in unison, turned their world, and soon the town's, upside down. Word spread quickly through the town of Weatherly. Neighbors came with warm bread, knitted blankets, and wide eyes. Newspapers from nearby Philadelphia and even as far as New York sent reporters. Photographers, doctors, and even a few clergymen arrived at the family's modest home, eager to witness what was being called God's multiplication and a perfect mirror miracle. Townsfolk whispered that the Kellners had been touched by angels, or cursed, depending on whom you asked. The 4 boys, named Jacob, Lucas, Matthias, and Johann, were carbon copies of one another. They each bore the same sandy blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and a crescent-shaped birthmark on the base of their necks. But it wasn't just their appearance that caused gasps and speculation, it was their behavior. Within the first few weeks, Elizabeth noted that all 4 boys would cry at the same time, stop at the same moment, and sleep in what seemed like a perfectly mirrored rhythm. If one hiccuped, the others followed. Their breathing patterns even aligned during naps. Wilhelm, a man grounded in superstition and the harsh logic of mining life, became withdrawn, drinking more and speaking less to his co-workers. He reportedly began keeping the boys indoors during the day, fearing they might be taken, or worse, watched too closely. Elizabeth, overwhelmed and increasingly anxious, welcomed the attention of physicians and naturalists who came asking questions, but became wary when many of them arrived with notebooks yet left with nothing written down. The family's pastor offered a baptism ceremony attended by nearly the entire town. During the event, the boys reportedly reacted in perfect unison when the holy water touched their foreheads, causing several elderly congregants to cross themselves and mutter. Rumors began to circulate about soul-sharing and one mind in 4 bodies. More than once, a visitor claimed that the infants seemed to track them with their eyes, simultaneously, without fail. By the time the boys reached 3 months old, the Kellners had become both local celebrities and subjects of whispered unease. A traveling physician from Harrisburg visited and performed a brief examination, concluding that he had never seen anything so precise, not even in twins. He allegedly recommended further study, perhaps even relocation to a medical institute. Wilhelm refused, citing fear of those who wished to cut God's work open. Even newspapers that originally celebrated the births began to publish more sensationalized accounts. One headline read, "4 faces, 1 fate, are the Kellner children a divine sign or a scientific omen?" Another article hinted at foreign experiments and unnatural inheritance. Yet no evidence was ever presented for these claims. Despite this, the public fascination grew, and with it, pressure on the Kellners to explain the inexplicable. Local mothers began to avoid bringing their children near the Kellner home. Some townspeople claimed livestock would refuse to graze near the family's property. The midwife who had delivered them reportedly retired abruptly, taking a job in a neighboring county and declining all questions about the birth. One neighbor claimed to have seen the boys crawling in a perfect square formation in the yard, giggling in unison. Despite the growing unease, no one could deny that the boys were healthy, bright-eyed, and physically robust. But their uncanny similarities remained. A family friend noted that even as infants, each boy reached for the same toy at the same moment, cried when another was moved, and mirrored each other's hand movements even while asleep. No one, not even the few doctors who visited in the early months, could offer a scientific explanation. By the time the Kellner boys reached their first birthday, their physical resemblance had become the least remarkable thing about them. Observers, including relatives, neighbors, and even a handful of traveling doctors, began to note something far stranger, behavioral synchronicity that extended far beyond coincidence. The four brothers didn't merely look the same, they moved the same, reacted the same, and seemed to function on a level of coordination that no one could explain. It began subtly, with the kind of mirroring behavior often seen in twins. But what made the Kellner quadruplets different was the precision of their movements and the inexplicable timing, as if their actions were dictated by a shared internal clock. When Jacob laughed, the others did too, within a breath. When Johann coughed, the remaining three followed without delay. At first, Elizabeth chalked it up to habit or mimicry, but as time passed, the occurrences multiplied and grew in complexity. During feeding time, each boy would reach for his spoon at the exact same moment, dip it into the porridge, and lift it to his mouth without looking at his brothers. There was no visual cue, no hesitation, no lead. It was not mimicry. It was simultaneity. Wilhelm, uneasy but fascinated, began to test them in small ways. He placed each boy in a separate corner of the room and clapped once. All four turned their heads in the same direction, blinked twice, and smiled. He set 4 toys in different locations, each a different color, and watched as all 4 boys, without prior agreement or visible signal, reached for the same red toy. It didn't matter where it was placed or how far apart they were, their decisions were the same, even without any observable communication. As the boys learned to walk, their synchronization deepened. Their first steps occurred on the same day, within the same hour. They wobbled forward not as individuals, but as a perfectly timed formation. Townsfolk who witnessed it called it a march of angels or ghosts in mirror skins. The 4 boys were often seen walking in a square, with 1 in front, 1 in back, and 2 on either side, an accidental choreography that no one had taught them. When one stumbled, the others seemed to anticipate it, slowing their pace instinctively, often without looking back. During playtime, the brothers arranged objects in symmetrical patterns, stacking blocks in exact vertical columns or aligning wooden soldiers in lines so precise that even adults found them unsettling. No one had taught them geometry, yet their game suggested an intuitive grasp of order and form. At night, they slept in parallel poses, arms folded the same way, heads tilted identically on their pillows. If one rolled over, the others followed moments later, as if tethered by an unseen thread. What disturbed observers the most, however, was their emotional synchronicity. If one child began to cry, the other 3 followed immediately, with identical pitch and duration. When Johann once scraped his knee on a rock, all 4 boys burst into tears despite only one being injured. Their wails began in unison and ceased together. A visiting midwife who witnessed this event wrote in her diary, "It was as if they all felt the pain of one. No delay. No confusion. Just shared agony." By the age of 3, the boys began to speak, and once again, the unusual patterns continued. Their first words, ma, da, and no, were spoken not separately over time, but together within minutes of one another. They developed their vocabulary at the same pace and began to answer questions in unison, especially when asked simple yes or no queries. It wasn't just that they agreed, it was the way they agreed, speaking simultaneously in the same tone and rhythm. More than one adult described their responses as eerily rehearsed, though no one had ever seen them practice anything. Even their silences matched. When a doctor asked them separately about their favorite animal, each boy fell quiet, stared at the wall, and then muttered "rabbit" at the exact same moment. A neighbor once said, "It was like hearing 4 voices from one soul." The brothers rarely argued, and when they did so in mirror gestures, arms crossing in perfect sync, brows furrowing identically, words echoing each other like reflections in a canyon. Attempts to study them only added to the mystery. When a physician from Baltimore brought a set of sensory tests, including touch response experiments and visual stimuli, the boys produced identical results down to the millisecond. Their pupils dilated simultaneously when shown a bright lantern. Their heartbeats, measured crudely with a stethoscope, thudded in time. Even their blinking, recorded by a curious local who sketched them obsessively, occurred with uncanny synchronicity. As the boys grew older, the connection seemed to deepen rather than diminish. They were never seen apart, and if separated even briefly, they would become visibly distressed. Teachers at the one-room schoolhouse noted that while other children fidgeted, got distracted, or learned at different rates, the Kellner boys turned pages in perfect rhythm, wrote their letters in identical handwriting, and appeared to know when one of them had made a mistake, even from across the room. As the peculiar reputation of the Kellner brothers spread beyond the confines of Weatherly, word of their synchronized behaviors and unsettling sameness reached the ears of medical institutions across Pennsylvania and beyond. By the mid-1870s, several physicians, scientists, and natural philosophers attempted to arrange formal studies of the boys. What they encountered, however, was a strange and growing resistance, not just from the Kellner family, but from the institutions themselves. In a period when medical curiosity was often unrestrained and ethics loose at best, the refusal to study a phenomenon so rare was, in itself, suspicious. The first attempt came from a university physician in Philadelphia, Dr. Horace Leland, who had read about the Kellner brothers in a local gazette. Intrigued by the possibility of genetically identical quadruplets exhibiting mirrored development, he traveled to Weatherly with the intention of observing the children. He arrived with assistants, instruments, and a journal in which he intended to document every interaction. However, after one visit, during which he appeared visibly shaken, he packed up his equipment and returned to the city without explanation. He never published any findings, and his personal notes from the trip, reportedly filled with observations, mysteriously vanished from his office just weeks later. Others followed, from both academic and private sectors. A team from the Allegheny Institute for Natural Study sent a formal request to house the boys in a facility for 3 weeks of observation. The Kellners refused, citing Wilhelm's growing distrust of outsiders. But what puzzled local officials was the Institute's sudden withdrawal of the proposal, despite having pushed aggressively just days before. One letter from the Institute simply stated that, upon further consideration, the case exceeds the scope of our inquiry. What became clear over time was that something, or someone, was actively discouraging the medical community from pursuing the Kellner case. At least 2 physicians who had expressed public interest were later dismissed from their posts for unrelated infractions. One, Dr. Edwin Hargrave, had written a short paper titled Harmonic Cognition in Sibling Groups, the Kellner Case, before being abruptly removed from his university position. The paper was never published, and his draft was reportedly seized by the university's board. There were also accounts from local townsfolk that strangers, men in long coats who never gave their names, were seen visiting the Kellner residence at irregular intervals. Some claimed to overhear discussions through the open windows involving offers of money and relocation, offers that Wilhelm always refused. One neighbor, Mrs. Bernadine Rowe, claimed she saw one of the men leave in a rage, muttering in a foreign language and tossing a silver pocket watch into the road. No one ever identified the men, and when questioned by reporters, the Kellners offered no comment. As the boys reached the age of 6, the calls for study became more muted. Curiously, libraries and academic journals that once carried references to the identical Kellner quadruplets of Carbon County no longer included them in their indexes. A librarian in Harrisburg reported that one such article, previously held in the public reading room, had been removed from the archive and marked as recalled for error. The author's name, oddly, could no longer be found in the university's faculty registry. Even local documentation began to vanish. Baptism records, school attendance logs, and even property tax filings listing the number of children in the household were either altered or mysteriously incomplete. The town's only newspaper published a statement from the editor declaring that the Kellner family has requested privacy, though no such request was ever confirmed. The pastor who had performed the boy's baptism retired early and left town, taking all handwritten church records with him. A few brave individuals attempted to reignite the scientific interest. In 1881, a young psychology student from Boston wrote his thesis on communal consciousness in multiples, citing the Kellners extensively. Before his thesis could be defended, he was removed from the program for academic dishonesty, despite a lack of evidence. When a journalist attempted to interview him, the student claimed his notes had been burned in a fire, one that curiously affected only his dorm room. Over time, the academic silence surrounding the Kellners began to take on the weight of conspiracy. Professors who had once expressed open fascination now refused to discuss them at all. Institutions that prided themselves on cutting-edge study ignored what should have been a landmark case in genetics, psychology, or even parapsychology. The Kellner brothers, whose existence once sparked both awe and fear, were now subjects of deliberate erasure. Science, it seemed, had chosen not to pursue answers, not because they weren't there, but perhaps because those answers were already known, and no one wanted to admit what they implied. In the years following the peak of public curiosity surrounding the Kellner brothers, a strange and unsettling pattern began to emerge. The first signs were subtle, mentions in archived publications being quietly removed, citations vanishing from university records, and earlier eyewitness accounts suddenly marked as unverifiable. These early erasures were brushed off as clerical oversights or publication errors. But as more and more documents related to the Kellner case began to disappear without explanation, suspicion took root in those few who still remembered the bizarre, identical brothers of Weatherly. One of the earliest known reports on the Kellner brothers had been penned by a local journalist named Elias Grant, who in 1874 had spent a week with the family and submitted a lengthy piece to the Lehigh Valley Herald. The article was printed once, then never again. Within 6 months, the newspaper retracted it without explanation. When Elias attempted to reference the report in a separate article about rural phenomena, his editor refused, stating only that the piece was no longer on file. Elias's notes, including sketches of the brothers and his personal interviews with Elizabeth and Wilhelm, were said to have been stolen from his desk in the middle of the night. According to his surviving correspondence, Elias believed someone had broken into his home not for money, but for paper. School records from Weatherly's single-room schoolhouse had once documented the brothers' identical academic performance, unusual behavioral synchronicity, and eerie patterns in handwriting and test scores. Teachers had kept meticulous logs. Yet by 1880, nearly all entries pertaining to Jacob, Lucas, Matthias, and Johann had been torn from the ledgers. One former teacher, Miss Clara Dunn, testified decades later that officials from a government office she'd never heard of had come to inspect the school records and left with several folders under their arms. She was never contacted again, and the Kellner boys were suddenly withdrawn from school shortly afterward with no formal explanation. Medical records, too, began to disappear. Dr. Frederick Alwyn, one of the only physicians to examine the boys in depth, maintained a private ledger of his visit, including pulse rates, reflex responses, and behavior during minor sensory tests. He had written to a colleague in Ohio stating that he believed the boys were a biological riddle that conventional science would be ill-prepared to solve. Within 3 months of sending the letter, Dr. Alwyn's home and practice were destroyed in a fire that was never fully investigated. No injuries were reported, but his patient books, including the one with the Kellner records, were lost. The family's personal Bible, kept by Elizabeth and often used as a place to record births, illnesses, and religious milestones, once contained handwritten notes about the boys' development, illnesses, and strange behavioral patterns. A traveling preacher who visited the home in 1878 noted the entries in his diary. However, years later when the family Bible was inherited by a niece in Scranton, all the pages documenting the years between 1873 and 1881 had been cleanly cut out. No one in the family claimed responsibility, and no explanation was ever provided. The Weatherly Town Hall, once proud of the unusual notoriety the brothers had brought, began to change its tone as well. Census records that originally listed the Kellner quadruplets were amended with confusing annotations. One year, all 4 boys were listed by name, the next, only 2 appeared, and in later records, none were accounted for at all. When queried, officials offered vague remarks about clerical errors or mistaken identities. At one point, the brothers were even listed as presumed deceased, though no death certificates had ever been filed. The town's modest public library had collected newspaper clippings, medical pamphlets, and even sketches of the boys that had been published in a short-lived regional science journal. By 1885, every item pertaining to the Kellner family had vanished from the archives. The librarian at the time, Mr. Thomas Elbier, claimed they had been removed for preservation and reclassification, but when pressed, he could not name the person or institution that had made the request. He retired the following year and moved out of state. Visitors to Weatherly who had once inquired about the famous identical brothers found themselves met with blank stares or terse replies. Younger residents seemed unaware the brothers had ever existed. Older townsfolk responded with unease, claiming forgetfulness or changing the subject entirely. A few still remembered the strange boys who never walked alone and never spoke out of turn, but they were quick to dismiss it as a local legend or just a story. Despite the absence of written records, those who had seen the boys firsthand could not forget. Their memories did not erase so easily. The more the documentation vanished, the more vivid those recollections became for the few who had been there. Yet as the physical evidence dissolved, burned, redacted, or removed, the Kellners themselves began to fade from official history. Without documentation, there could be no legacy. Without names on paper, there could be no questions. And for reasons no one would ever openly admit, that seemed to be exactly what someone wanted. As the Kellner brothers grew older, the presence that once captivated and disturbed the small town of Weatherly began to recede into silence. While the early years of their lives had been marked by a swirl of fascination, whispers of miracles, and muted scientific curiosity, the next chapter of their existence was defined by withdrawal. Somewhere around their 8th year, the Kellner family began to disappear from public life, not physically, but socially. The shutters of their farmhouse remained closed more often. The boys, once a curious sight at Sunday church or walking in perfect step to the schoolhouse, were no longer seen in town. People noticed, but they rarely asked. Those who did were met with vague responses from Wilhelm, mentions of illness or private matters that required the boys to stay indoors. Elizabeth stopped attending church altogether. Even their 2 older daughters, once seen shopping at the town's general store, were now sent away to live with cousins near Allentown. Townsfolk speculated quietly, careful never to press too hard. There was something about the family now that gave people pause, a heaviness, a stillness that hung around their home like fog. It wasn't just that the Kellners were retreating. It was that they were being left alone. People who had once been eager to bring food, offer help, or simply sneak a look at the remarkable boys now found themselves walking faster past the Kellner property. Some claimed to hear murmured voices coming from the house, always 4 at once, always in unison. Neighbors claimed to see him patrolling the perimeter at night with a lantern and rifle, muttering to himself in German. When the local pastor stopped by to check on the family, Wilhelm answered the door but never opened it fully. He said the boys were growing too fast, in ways I don't understand. He refused prayers, declined offers of help, and finally asked not to be visited again. Inside the house, the boys were growing, taller, stronger, but more peculiar in their unity. Elizabeth, who kept to herself, told a visiting aunt that the boys rarely spoke now. They communicated in looks, in gestures, sometimes in perfectly timed movements that needed no verbal explanation. If one spilled a cup, another caught it before it hit the floor. When asked individual questions, they answered together. Even when apart in different rooms, they were somehow synchronized, one humming a tune, the others tapping the rhythm without hearing it. Elizabeth began to keep notes in secret. Though most of her journals were never recovered, one torn page found decades later behind a loose wallboard read, "They dream the same dreams. They sleep the same sleep. Sometimes I think they don't need me anymore." The isolation took its toll on the Kellner home. Paint peeled from the windowsills. The garden became overgrown. The once white curtains turned yellow with time and dust. There was no laughter from within, no crying, no sound at all save the occasional scraping of chairs or the thud of synchronized footsteps. The house had grown quiet in the loudest way. Visitors who approached the door, even salesmen or census takers, spoke afterward of an odd stillness inside, as if time itself had slowed beyond the threshold. One man claimed he knocked for 5 full minutes before a single eye appeared through the curtain. It stared silently, blinking in a slow, measured rhythm, before vanishing again. He never knocked again. Weatherly itself began to forget, or perhaps chose to forget. Children who were born after 1875 grew up hearing only fragments of the Kellner story, tales told by older siblings, often brushed aside by parents as exaggerations. A new schoolteacher arrived from Bethlehem and, upon inquiring about the famous identical boys, was told only that, "They don't come out anymore." When she asked what that meant, no one would explain. A local merchant once brought a delivery of flour to the Kellner home and claimed to see all 4 boys through the window, standing still at the top of the stairs, watching him in absolute silence. He left the sack on the porch and walked away without knocking. He later said their faces hadn't aged the way other children's did, that their eyes were too knowing, too still, too much the same. By the winter of 1886, the Kellner brothers were 13 years old, and their presence in Weatherly had become something closer to legend than reality. Many in the town believed they had moved away, others whispered that they had died young and quietly, buried in unmarked graves to avoid further attention. The truth, as it slowly unfolded in hushed conversations and fragmented recollections, was neither simple nor peaceful. It began with silence but ended with fear, a feeling that crept into the town like frost under a doorframe. Something had gone wrong inside the Kellner house, and the people who once couldn't look away now refused to look at all. There was no funeral, no obituary, no public announcement. But one morning, the postman noted that a black cloth had been tied to the Kellner front door, a traditional sign of mourning in the German community. When asked who had died, Wilhelm simply replied, "It doesn't matter anymore." He offered no details, and no one pressed him. But a few days later, a laborer working on the nearby rail line claimed to have seen 2 men, dressed in long coats, digging in the woods behind the Kellner house just before sunrise. The men had no tools but carried with them a long wooden crate. When the laborer returned hours later, there was nothing but turned earth and pine needles covering what he swore had been a fresh grave. Shortly afterward, Johann was no longer seen through the windows. Then Lucas vanished. Jacob and Matthias remained visible for a few more weeks, sometimes appearing in the window together, watching the road with identical expressions, their silhouettes unmoving. Eventually, even they were gone. The house grew darker. Curtains that had once opened briefly each morning stayed shut. At night, no lamps glowed from inside, and the usual faint hum of voices that neighbors had grown used to, for speaking in eerie harmony, faded into a cold, absolute stillness. Whispers emerged quickly, as they always do in small towns. Some believed the boys had succumbed to a mysterious illness that affected them all at once, their synchronicity becoming a shared doom. Others insisted they had been taken, by the government, by doctors, by men with no names who had always been interested in the Kellner family. A few suggested the boys had never been entirely natural, and that their sudden absence was a return to some place they truly belonged, a realm not of this world. These ideas spread without evidence, passed in taverns and on church steps, shared in tones just above a whisper. What cemented the unease were the few people who attempted to investigate. In the spring of 1887, a young constable named Arlen Pierce was assigned to conduct a welfare check after a distant relative of Elizabeth reported receiving a strange letter filled with nonsensical symbols and repeated lines written in 4 identical scripts. The constable knocked twice, then again. There was no answer. He circled the house, finding no footprints, no signs of recent life, no scent of food or coal smoke. But in the dirt behind the shed, he found something strange, a perfect square of stones, 12 on each side, forming a boundary around nothing at all. At its center lay 4 small chairs, hand-carved and facing one another. He turned and left without entering the house. Several months later, a group of schoolboys dared one another to sneak into the Kellner property. They returned pale and shaken. One claimed they had heard breathing coming from all sides of the house, but when they peeked inside, the home was completely empty. Another swore he had seen Jacob, older now, his face thin and hollow, standing in the upstairs window with his hand pressed against the glass. When the boys ran, none of them looked back. Reports of strange lights and faint, rhythmic noises continued for another year. Some claimed to hear voices, all speaking at once, repeating the same phrases over and over. A few farmers passing by at night said they saw 4 figures walking in a square around the house, always counterclockwise, never breaking formation. But these stories slowly faded as fewer people dared venture near the property. By 1889, the Kellner home was abandoned. The windows were shattered. The door had been removed from its hinges. The roof had begun to collapse inward. The yard, once so meticulously kept by Elizabeth, had grown wild with weeds and crooked trees. Yet despite its ruin, no one in Weatherly offered to tear it down. The lot remained untouched. Some said it was cursed. Others simply claimed it was better left alone. Years later, when the property was finally surveyed for potential resale, the new landowner discovered something unusual. Beneath the cellar floor, hidden behind a wall of crumbling stone, was a small room. Inside were 4 sets of shoes, worn down but perfectly aligned, 4 beds made with military precision, and a set of journals written in 4 identical hands. The pages were covered not in stories or confessions but in numbers, diagrams, and phrases repeated endlessly, as if trying to remember something, or forget something, all at once.